Orthodox Survival Course, Part 2 of Lecture 8. Meaning of Revolution, Russian Reactionaries. Written by Father Seraphim Rose and Father Podmashinsky. C. Alexander III. A. His tutor Pt.2 gave him straight, orthodox, anti-revolutionary education, acquainted him with the recent past in revolutionary thought. Rakinsky developed parish schools, Dostoevsky, Melenkov, and Pechersky. B. Voices calling him to anti-liberal course, Talberg, page 229. From a letter of Pt.2 to Alexander, March 6, 1881, 5 days after the murder of Tsar Alexander II. I am resolving to write again because things are terrible, and there is no time to lose. If they will sing you the old siren song that you need to be calm, that you need to continue in a liberal direction, that you need to yield to so-called public opinion, oh, for God's sake, don't believe them, Your Majesty, don't listen. This would be ruin, the ruin of Russia and of you. This is as clear as day to me. Your safety would not be protected by this, but would be further diminished. The insane villains that killed your father will not be satisfied with any concessions, and will only become more violent. And it can be suppressed. The evil seed can be torn up, only by fighting against it to the death, by iron and blood. To be victorious is not difficult. Until now, all have wished to flee the struggle and have deceived the reposed sovereign, you, themselves, and everyone and everything in the world, because they were not people of reason, power, and heart, but flaccid eunuchs and conjurers. No, Your Majesty, the only one sure, direct way is to stand on your feet and begin, not slumbering for a moment, a most holy fight, as there has only been in Russia. The whole nation awaits this authoritative decision, and as soon as they sense the sovereign will, all will rise up, all will be revived, and will regain their healthy color in the air. On that day he received a note from the sovereign. I thank you from my whole soul for your heartfelt letter, with which I am in full agreement. Drop by to see me tomorrow at 3 o'clock, and I shall be happy to have a talk with you. All my hope is in God. The following is not in the outline, but the last half of it is marked by Father Seraphim in his copy of Talberg's book, and one sentence is even underlined. This is from a letter of Pt.2, published in a magazine called Russian Archive. Loris Melikov had the intention to do Russia the favor of giving it a constitution, or by setting a beginning to it by summoning deputies from all of Russia. In this connection, a conference took place in February with Emperor Alexander II. On March 2nd, the Council of Ministers was appointed to be at the sovereigns for a final decision. But in the meantime, Loris Melikov had already prepared the triumphant publication of this, which was to appear in the government Heraldo on the 5th. And suddenly came the catastrophe. From the 2nd of March, the magazines began, in connection with the regicide, to demand a constitution. Loris Melikov sent to ask them that they be silent, if only for 15 days. And then they gathered us in the Council of Ministers with the sovereign on Sunday at 2 p.m. They invited me, the elderly S.G. Stroganov, and the Grand Dukes. The sovereign, having declared what the business was, added that it had not been decided by the reposed, and that it was in doubt, and he asked all to speak without constraint. Loris Melikov began to read the protocol and the draft declaration already prepared in the name of the new sovereign, in which he considered it, as it were, his sacred duty to fulfill the testament of his father. And imagine, they had the shamelessness to leave in this declaration, now, all the same motives that had been placed in the previous one. That public order had been established everywhere, the uprising had been suppressed, the exiles had returned, and so on. There is no time to describe all of this in detail. The first one to come out against it was Stroganov, briefly but energetically. Then Valuyev, Abaza, and Milyutin gave bombastic speeches about how all of Russia is waiting for this blessing. Milyutin at this time made a slip of the tongue, referring to the people as irrational masses. Valuyev, instead of the word people, used the word peoples. There further spoke Nabokov, Saburov, and the rest. Only Pasyet and Makov came out against it. But when they turned to me, I could no longer hold back the waves of my indignation. Having explained all the falseness of the institution, I said that shame and disgrace covered my face when thinking of what a time we were discussing this, when the body of our sovereign lay still unburied. And who was guilty in this? His blood was on us and our children. We were all guilty in his death. What had we been doing all this time and during his reign? We talked and talked, listened to ourselves and to one another, and everything from his institution was turned under our hands into a lie, and the freedom granted by him had become false. And in recent years, in years of explosions and mines, what had we done to protect him? We talked, and only that. All of our senses should have been concentrated in the fear that he might be murdered. But we allowed into our souls so many base, despicable fears, and began to tremble before public opinions. That is, the opinions of contemptuous journalists, and what Europe would say. And we know that through magazines. You can imagine with what thunder my words fell. Those adjacent to me, Abaz and Loris Melikov, could barely contain their fury at me. Abaz replied quite sharply, "From what the Ober-Procurator of the Synod has said, it would follow that everything done in the past reign was of no use whatever, the freeing of the serfs and the rest, and that the only thing left for us to do after this is to request our dismissal. The sovereign, who at my words, 'His blood is on us,' interrupted me with the exclamation, 'This is true,' supported me, saying that really all were guilty, and that he did not exclude himself. We spoke further. Pitiful words were heard, that something should be done, but that something meant the institution, or constitution. C. Most ministers were for liberalism and reforms in government, but Pobanostev and others were for autocracy. Alex, resolved to go against the spirit of the times, did not give himself over to unrealizable fantasies and scabby liberalism. Against constitution, nationalism. Russia already had a constitution in orthodoxy, an ancient institution which had trust between Tsar and people. D. Pobanostev stands up against liberalism and constitutionalism. The Tsar is mournful. 232. Disturbances disappeared, but heavy weight was on the Tsar. 233. On April 29, 1881, the decisive word of the Tsar rang out in a manifest, in which it was said, "The voice of God commands us to embark vigorously upon the matter of governance, hoping in divine providence, with faith in the power and truth of autocratic rule, which we are called to uphold and preserve from any encroachment upon it, for the good of the people. May the hearts of our faithful subjects, of all who love the fatherland and are dedicated to the royal authority inherited from generation to generation, who have been confounded by anxiety and terror, be encouraged. Under its protection and in indissoluble union with it, our land has more than once survived great strife and has reached a state of power and glory in the midst of grievous trials and misfortunes, with faith in God, who establishes her fate. Dedicating ourselves to our great service, we summon all our faithful subjects to serve us and the state in faith and righteousness, in uprooting the revolts which have disgraced the Russian land, in the confirmation of faith and morality, in the good upbringing of children, in the annihilation of falsehood and thievery, in the establishment of truth, in the activities of the institutions granted Russia by its benefactor, our beloved father. And here the darkness of sedition, cut through by the light, bright as lightning, of the Tsar's words, began quickly to disperse," writes Nazarevsky. The revolt, which seemed invincible, melted like wax before the face of fire, vanished like smoke under the wings of the wind. Sedition in people's minds began quickly to be replaced by Russian sensibility. Dissoluteness and self-will gave way to order and discipline. Free thinking no longer trampled upon orthodoxy like some kind of ultramontanism, or upon our dear church like clericalism. The authority of the indisputable and hereditary national supreme rule stood again upon its historical, traditional height. But it was not easy for the autocrat to bear this difficult yoke for the benefit of Russia. On December 31, 1881, in a letter of reply to Pobedonostsev, the sovereign wrote, "I thank you, most gracious Konstantin Petrovich, for your kind letter and all your wishes. A terrible, frightful year is coming to a close. A new one is beginning. And what awaits us ahead? It is so frightfully difficult at times that it were not for my faith in God and His limitless mercy, of course, I would have no other choice than to put a bullet through my head. But I am not faint-hearted, and the chief thing is that I have faith in God, and I believe that there will come, at last, happy days for our dear Russia. Often, very often, I recall the words of the Holy Gospel. Let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God and believe in me. These powerful words act salutarily upon me. With full hope in God's mercy, I close this letter. Thy will be done, O Lord. St. John of Kronstadt at deathbed. Repose of Tsar Alexander III. A description of his last days is given by Nazarevsky, who was able to receive proper notification. On the 5th of October, a bulletin carefully composed by Zakharin and Professor Leiden, who was recalled from Berlin, concerning the serious illness of the sovereign, made not only all Russia, but even the whole world wince. Everyone, in the fear for the life of the emperor, who had gained a powerful influence absolutely everywhere, began to pray for his recovery. It became clear to everyone, and to the sufferer himself, that the end was approaching. The bright mood and manly calmness of the sick Tsar were striking. Despite his weakness, insomnia, and heart palpitations, he still did not wish to take to his bed, and strove to continue his occupation with matters of state, of which the last were written reports concerning matters in the Far East, and Korea in particular. By the 9th of October, the invalid told his confessor for certain that he sensed the closeness of death, and with great joy heard his suggestion that he receive the holy mysteries. He was only sorry for one thing, that he could not, as before, as is usually done during Great Lent, prepare himself for this great sacrament. At his confession, which took place soon thereafter, the sovereign knelt and made full prostrations like a healthy man. But for communion he was now no longer able to raise himself up. He was raised up by the empress and his confessor. With profound reverence, the sovereign communed the body and blood of Christ. On the following morning, on October 10th, the sovereign cheerfully and sincerely met Father John of Kronstadt, who had arrived at Livadia, and in the evening he met the fiancée of his firstborn, Princess Alix of Hesse, who had hastened to the Crimean. When he greeted the respected pastor, the sovereign, with the meekness that distinguished him, said, "I myself did not dare to invite you to such a long journey, but when Grand Duchess Alexandra Iosifovna suggested that I invite you to Livadia, I happily agreed to it, and I thank you for coming. I implore you to pray for me. I'm quite unwell." As Father John related, then he went into the other room and asked me to pray together with him. He knelt, and I began to recite the prayers. His Majesty was praying with deep feeling. His head was bowed, and he was immersed within himself. When I had finished, he arose and asked me to pray in the future. In the evening, to meet his son's bride, he gave order to be given his dress coat and put it on, despite the swelling in his feet, went to meet her. He expressed his paternal feelings to her, accepting her as a dear daughter, close to his heart. The excitement of that day evidently had a good effect on him, and he began to feel better. This continued until October 18th. This kindled the hope in those around him that the sovereign would recover. On a memorable day, October 17th, Father John of Kronstadt gave the sovereign the holy mysteries for the second time. After the liturgy, he went in to the sick man with the holy chalice in his hands. The Tsar firmly, clearly, and with deep feeling, repeated the words of the priest. "I believe, O Lord, and I confess that thou art truly the Christ." And he reverently received communion from the chalice. Tears of contrition fell upon his breast. He again felt an upsurge of energy, and the Tsar was just about to set about his business again, and even to work at night. But he became worse, and an inflammatory process of the lungs came to light, along with the expectoration of blood. The dying man manfully struggled with his infirmity and displayed the power of his will. On the 18th, a courier was sent to Petersburg for the last time with resolved business. On the following day, once again he endeavored to work on several reports, and wrote for the last time. In Levadia, read. But this was already his last day of service to Russia. The great toiler of the Russian land became severely weakened, and now awaited his approaching passage to the other world. The sovereign spent the night without sleep, earnestly waiting for the dawn. Arising from his bed, sat in an armchair. The day came, dismal and cold. A strong wind came up. The sea groaned with violent choppiness. At 7 o'clock, the sovereign sent for the Tsarevich and spoke privately with him for about an hour. After this he summoned the Empress, who found him in tears. He told her, "I sense my end." The Empress said, "For God's sake, don't say that. You will be well." "No," the sovereign firmly replied. "This has dragged on too long. I feel that death is close. Be at peace." "I'm absolutely at peace." At 10 o'clock, his relatives gathered around the dying man, and he, fully conscious, tried to say an amiable word to each one. Recalling that the 20th was the birthday of Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, the sovereign wanted to congratulate her. Conversing with his close ones, he did not forget about his soul, and asked that his confessor be summoned to say prayers, and desired again to commune the holy mysteries. Having communed the sovereign, the confessor wished to withdraw, so as to leave the dying man among his family. But the sovereign detained him and thanked him sincerely. The pastor, leaning towards the sovereign, thanked him on behalf of the Holy Church for the fact that he was always her unwavering son and faithful defender, on behalf of the Russian people, for whom he sacrificed all his strength, and finally he expressed the firm hope that in the heavenly dwelling places that there would be prepared for him an imperishable kingdom of glory and blessedness with all the saints. At 11 o'clock, the condition of the sick man became especially difficult. Shortness of breath increased, the activity of his heart declined, and he asked that Father John of Kronstadt be summoned, who, having come, anointed the body of the sovereign with oil from the lampada, and, in accordance with his request, placed his hands upon his head. Fearing that the respected pastor was becoming tired, the dying man asked him to rest, and when the latter asked him whether he was tiring him by holding his hands on his head, he heard, "On the contrary, it's very easy for me when you hold them there." And he added, touchingly, "The Russian people love you." With his weakening voice, the sovereign began to express his farewell affection, first to the Empress, then to the children. They stood near him, and the Empress held his hand. At 2 o'clock his pulse increased. The last minutes had come. The royal sufferer, held up by the shoulders by the Tsarevich, leaned his head upon the Empress's shoulder, closed his eyes, and quietly reposed. It was 2:15 in the afternoon. So ended his life, this good sufferer for the Russian land. As in ancient Rus, they called his holy heavenly protector, the right-believing Alexander Nevsky. The ever-memorable Father John thus described these sorrowful days. "I celebrated the liturgy daily, either in the Levadia church or occasionally in Orend, and on the aforementioned day, directly after celebrating the liturgy in the latter church, I hastened with the cup of life to the august, sick one, who received with reverent feelings from my hands the life-creating mysteries. On October 20th, the sovereign emperor again wished to see me. I hastened to appear immediately after celebrating the liturgy, and remained in the imperial presence right up to the blessed repose of the sovereign. By wish of the empress, I read the prayer for healing for the sick, and anointed his feet and other parts of his body with oil. This oil from the lampada of a revered miracle-working icon, by wish of zealous people, was provided by one of the priests of Yalta, Father Alexander, for the anointing of the august, sick one, which was done. Receiving with sincere faith this reverent zeal, the sovereign emperor expressed the wish that I lay my hands on his head, and when I held them there, his majesty said to me, "The people love you." "Yes," said I, "Your majesty, your people love me." Then he deigned to say, "Yes, because they know who you are and what you are," his exact words. After this, the august felt a strong attack of shortness of breath, and oxygen was continually pumped into his mouth. He was in great pain. On the left of the august was the empress. Before him stood his two eldest sons and the bride of the Tsarevich. On the right were Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich and Olga Alexandrovna, and I stood by the headrest of the armchair. "Is it not painful for your imperial majesty that I am holding my hands on your head?" "No," the sovereign deigned to answer. "It's easier for me when you hold your hands over me." This was because I had appeared immediately after serving liturgy, and the palms of my hands held the most pure body of the Lord, and had been a partaker of the holy mysteries. Kronstadt, November 8th, 1894. Archpriest John Sergeyev. D. Pt.2. Notes from Father Seraphim's Revolution chapter of Anarchism, manuscript. Only, however, in the supremely reactionary, autocratic Russian Empire did the political order itself retain, for all its weakening in the period of westernization, some sense of its old absolute foundation. And even in Russia, it was only, perhaps, a very few statesmen like Pt.2 who were seriously concerned to preserve this foundation. Also, in his Notes for the Empire, Old Order chapter, Father Seraphim lists a quote by Pt.2. "Russia has been strong thanks to autocracy, thanks to the unlimited mutual trust between the people and its czars." 1. Russian tradition unique, not influenced by revolution or liberalism. Vierek 84-85. 2. Quotes 120-123. 3. Watched over new literature and philosophy and art. Admired Tsar against Solieni, Toilette, blasphemous paintings of J, opera during Lent, against what is revolting and propagandistic. E. Dostoevsky. 1. Radical youth caught in Fourierist group, condemned, Siberia, then became Tsarist. Having himself been deeply infected by revolutionary disease, he saw deeper than anyone its meaning and end. taken from Father Seraphim's Russian Literature, taped lecture. Dostoevsky lived, well, he died in 1881 or 2, and his life was, in his youth, he was at the very time when Gogol was being converted, in the 1840s. Dostoevsky was taking part in discussion groups. There was one called Petrochevsky's group, which was discussing the socialist ideas of Fourier. But this group was not so serious. They were not trying to overthrow the government. And whenever they talked about things like that, it was on a very naive level. They had no organization, no thought at all about overthrowing the government or taking over. They just had idealistic notions about how wonderful it would be if everybody was peaceful and harmonious. It was of a perfect government, and nobody oppressed anybody else. And Fourier seemed to point to that. Fourier was just a crazy man who lived in the West. Crazy, that is, according to, but he was in the spirit of the times. And later on, he bequeathed this to people like Marx, who made this whole idea much more serious, made it so-called scientific. But Fourier was dreaming about paradise with lemonade fountains and all kinds of images like that. But this spirit of egalitarianism and socialism sort of was in the air. That was the way the Western ideas were largely coming in from Europe. And Dostoevsky was discussing these and dreaming about the bright future, already writing novels. And then he was caught. That is, this group was found out by the Tsar's police. They broke in and arrested him together with the other people from his group. And he was then sentenced to death. They thought it was a serious thing. They were going to execute him and cut off the revolution at the root. But the Tsar had in mind, Tsar Nicholas I, who had a very patronizing attitude toward his subjects. That is, he had a very personal interest in the fate of each subject. And he did this. He allowed this death sentence to be given, intending to, not to carry it through, so that his people would, when they found themselves in front of the executioners, and then the sentence was postponed or abrogated, come to their senses and repent. And in the case of Dostoevsky, it had just this effect. The other ones, I don't know how they ended up. But he went through, of course, his whole life comes to an end. He's still a young man in his 30s, even late 20s, and he sees the rifles drawn in front of him. His life comes to an end. What has he done? He hasn't thought much about religion up till then. And then, all of a sudden, they say the Tsar has pardoned you. You will have 8 years in Siberia instead. So he went to Siberia, and he's written in some of his books his experiences in Siberia. He lived 8 years there, and he lived a very hard life. They slept on hard boards, many people in a room. The food was poor, although Solzhenitsyn makes a point of comparing accounts like the ones of Dostoevsky describes with accounts of communist prisons. And what sounds to us like a terrible time, after he describes communist prisons, then he describes Tsarist prisons. It's obvious that the Tsarist prisons were quite luxurious compared to the communist prisons. Of course, Dostoevsky, being a lower class, did not have a comfortable exile that many of the upper class people did, who just lived like free citizens in exile. But when he went through this experience which, from the political side, made him, after 8 years in Siberia under very difficult times under a difficult regime, came out a Tsarist Orthodox Christian. and converted to the whole idea of Tsarism. It means that there was something deep happening in him, and he reformed his whole ideas about life, about Christianity, about where he was going, about the meaning of life. But at the same time, that's from the philosophical side. His whole ideas are going to the Grand Inquisitor and the meaning of modern history and so forth. On the Christian side, I'd like to emphasize today, he went through some kind of a special thing. He was converted to Christianity, Christian ideas, and he began to write stories. End of 1980 Russian literature tape passage. Quote, "The Possessed" analyzes revolutionary mentality, both its stupidities and deep thinkers. Pages 397 through 400, on quintets. Virginsky himself was rather unwell that evening, but he came in and sat in an easy chair by the tea table. All the guests were sitting down too, and the orderly way in which they were ranged on chairs suggested a meeting. Evidently all were expecting something and were filling up the interval with loud but irrelevant conversation. When Stavrogin and Verkhonovsky appeared, there was a sudden hush. But I must be allowed to give a few explanations to make things clear. I believe that all these people had come together in the agreeable expectation of hearing something particularly interesting, and had notice of it beforehand. They were the flower of the reddest radicalism of our ancient town, and had been carefully picked out by Virginsky for this meeting. I may remark, too, that some of them, though not very many, had never visited him before. Of course, most of the guests had no clear idea why they had been summoned. It was true that at that time all took Pyotr Stefanovich for a fully authorized emissary from abroad. This idea had somehow taken root among them at once and naturally flattered them. And yet among the citizens assembled ostensibly to keep a name day, there were some who had been approached with definite proposals. Pyotr Verkhovensky had succeeded in getting together a quintet amongst us, like the one he had already formed in Moscow, and, as appeared later, in our province among the officers. It was said that he had another ex-province. This quintet of the elect were sitting now at the general table, and very skillfully succeeded in giving themselves the air of being quite ordinary people, so that no one could have known them. They were, since it is no longer a secret, Liputin, then Virginsky himself, then Shigalov, a gentleman with long ears, the brother of Madame Virginsky, Lyamshin, and lastly a strange person called Tolkachenko, a man of 40, who was famed for his vast knowledge of the people, especially of thieves and robbers. He used to frequent the taverns on purpose, though not only with the object of studying the people, and plumed himself on his shabby clothes, tarred boots, and crafty wink, and a flourish of peasant phrases. Lyamshin had once or twice brought him to Stefan Trofimovich's gatherings, where, however, he did not make a great sensation. He used to make his appearance in the town from time to time, chiefly when he was out of a job. He was employed on the railway. Every one of these 5 champions had formed this first group in the fervent conviction that their quintet was only one of hundreds and thousands of similar groups scattered all over Russia, and that they all depended on some immense central but secret power, which in its turn was intimately connected with the revolutionary movement all over Europe. But I regret to say that even at that time there was beginning to be dissension among them. Though they had ever since the spring been expecting Pyotr Verkovensky, whose coming had been heralded first by Tolkachenko and then by the arrival of Shigalov. Though they had expected extraordinary miracles from him, and though they had responded to his first summons without the slightest criticism, yet they had no sooner formed the quintet than they all somehow seemed to feel insulted, and I really believe it was owing to the promptitude with which they consented to join. They had joined, of course, from a not ignoble feeling of shame, for fear people might say afterwards that they had not dared to join. Still, they felt Pyotr Verkovensky ought to have appreciated their heroism, and have rewarded it by telling them some really important bits of news at least. But Verkovensky was not at all inclined to satisfy their legitimate curiosity, and told them nothing but what was necessary. He treated them in general with great sternness and rather casually. This was positively irritating, and Comrade Shigalov was already egging the others on to insist on his explaining himself. Though, of course, not at Virginsky's, where so many outsiders were present. I have an idea that the above-mentioned members of the first quintet were disposed to suspect that among the guests of Virginsky's that evening, some were members of other groups unknown to them, belonging to the same secret organization and founded in the town by the same Verkovensky, so that in fact all present were suspecting one another, and posed in various ways to one another, which gave the whole party a very perplexing and even romantic air. Yet there were persons present who were beyond all suspicion. For instance, a major in the service, a near relation of Virginsky, a perfectly innocent person who had not been invited, but had come of himself for the name-day celebration, so that it was impossible not to receive him. But Virginsky was quite unperturbed, as the major was incapable of betraying them, for in spite of his stupidity, he had all his life been fond of dropping in wherever extreme radicals met. He did not sympathize with their ideas himself, but he was very fond of listening to them. What's more, he had even been compromised indeed. It had happened in his youth that whole bundles of manifestos and of numbers of The Bell had passed through his hands, and although he had been afraid even to open them, yet he would have considered it absolutely contemptible to refuse to distribute them. And there are such people in Russia even to this day. The rest of the guests were either types of honorable amour propre crushed and embittered, or types of the generous impulsiveness of ardent youth. There were 2 or 3 teachers, of whom one, a lame man of 45, a master in the high school, was a very malicious and strikingly vain person, and 2 or 3 officers. Of the latter, one very young artillery officer who had only just come from a military training school, a silent lad who had not yet made friends with anyone, turned up now at Virginsky's with a pencil in his hand, and scarcely taking any part in the conversation, continually made notes in his notebook. Everybody saw this, but everyone pretended not to. There was, too, an idle divinity student who had helped Lyamshin to put indecent photographs into the gospel woman's pack. He was a solid youth with a free and easy though mistrustful manner, with an unchangeably satirical smile, together with a calm air of triumphant faith in his own perfection. There was also present, I don't know why, the mayor's son, that unpleasant and prematurely exhausted youth, to whom I have referred already in telling the story of the lieutenant's little wife. He was silent the whole evening. Finally, there was a very enthusiastic and tousle-headed schoolboy of 18, who sat with the gloomy air of a young man whose dignity had been wounded, evidently distressed by his 18 years. This infant was already the head of an independent group of conspirators which had been formed in the highest class of the gymnasium, as it came out afterwards to the surprise of everyone. I haven't mentioned Shatov. He was there at the farthest corner of the table, his chair pushed back a little out of the row. He gazed at the ground, was gloomily silent, refused tea and bread, and did not for one instant let his cap go out of his hand, as though to show that he was not a visitor, but had come on business. And when he liked, he would get up and go away. Kirillov was not far from him. He, too, was very silent, but he did not look at the ground. On the contrary, he scrutinized intently every speaker with his fixed, lusterless eyes, and listened to everything without the slightest emotion or surprise. Some of the visitors who had never seen him before stole thoughtful glances at him. I can't say whether Madame Virginsky knew anything about the existence of the quintet. I imagine she knew everything, and from her husband. The girl student, of course, took no part in anything, but she had an anxiety for her own. She intended to stay only a day or two, and then to go on farther and farther from one university town to another, to show active sympathy with the sufferings of poor students, and to rouse them to protest. She was taking with her some hundreds of copies of a lithographed appeal, I believe of her own composition. It is remarkable that the schoolboy conceived an almost murderous hatred for her from the first moment, though he saw her for the first time in his life, and she felt the same for him. The major was her uncle, and met her today for the first time after 10 years. When Stavrogin and Verkovensky came in, her cheeks were as red as cranberries. She had just quarreled with her uncle over his views on the woman question. 409 through 413, 415 on Shigolov. Shigolov went on. Dedicating my energies to the study of the social organization which is in the future to replace the present condition of things, I've come to the conviction that all makers of social systems from ancient times up to the present year have been dreamers, tellers of fairy tales, fools who contradicted themselves, who understood nothing of natural science and the strange animal called man. Plato, Rousseau, Fourier's, columns of aluminum, are only fit for sparrows and not for human society. But now that we are all at last preparing to act, a new form of social organization is essential. In order to avoid further uncertainty, I propose my own system of world organization. Here it is. He tapped the notebook. I wanted to expound my views to the meeting in the most concise form possible, but I see that I should need to add a great many verbal explanations, and so the whole exposition would occupy at least 10 evenings, one for each of my chapters. There was the sound of laughter. I must add, besides, that my system is not yet complete. Laughter again. I am perplexed by my own data, and my conclusion is a direct contradiction of my original idea with which I started. Starting from unlimited freedom, I arrive at unlimited despotism. I will add, however, that there can be no solution of the social problem but mine. The laughter grew louder and louder, but it came chiefly from the younger and less initiated visitors. There was an expression of some annoyance on the faces of Madame Virginsky, Laputin, and the lame teacher. If you've been unsuccessful in making your system consistent, and have been reduced to despair yourself, what could we do with it? One officer observed warily. You are right, Mr. Officer. Shigalov turned sharply to him, especially using the word despair. Yes, I am reduced to despair. Nevertheless, nothing can take the place of the system set forth in my book, and there is no other way out of it. No one can invent anything else. And so I hasten without loss of time to invite the whole society to listen for 10 evenings to my book, and then give their opinions of it. If the members are unwilling to listen to me, let us break up from the start. The men to take up service under government, the women to their cooking. For if you reject my solution, you'll find no other, none whatever. If they let the opportunity slip, it will simply be for their loss, for they will be bound to come back to it again. There was a stir in the company. Is he mad or what? Voices asked. So the whole point lies in Shigalov's despair, Liamshin commented. And the essential question is whether he must despair or not. Shigalov's being on the brink of despair is a personal question, declared the schoolboy. I propose we put it to a vote how far Shigalov's despair affects the common cause, and at the same time whether it's worthwhile listening to him or not, an officer suggested gaily. That's not right. The lame teacher put in his spoke at last. As a rule, he spoke with a rather mocking smile, so that it was difficult to make out whether he was in earnest or joking. That's not right, gentlemen. Mr. Shigalov is too much devoted to his task and is also too modest. I know his book. He suggests as a final solution of the question the division of mankind into two unequal parts. 1/10 enjoys absolute liberty and unbounded power over the 9/10. The others will have to give up all individuality and become, so to speak, a herd, and, through boundless submission, will by a series of regenerations attain primeval innocence. Something like the Garden of Eden. They'll all have to work, however. The measures proposed by the author for depriving 9/10 of mankind of their freedom and transforming them into a herd through the education of whole generations are very remarkable, founded on the facts of nature and highly logical. One may not agree with some of the deductions, but it would be difficult to doubt the intelligence and knowledge of the author. It's a pity that the time required, 10 evenings, is impossible to arrange for, or that we might hear a great deal that's interesting. Can you be in earnest? Madame Virginsky addressed the lame gentleman with a shade of positive uneasiness in her voice. When that man doesn't know what to do with people, and so turns 9/10 of them into slaves. I've suspected him for a long time. You say that of your own brother? Asked the lame man. Relationship? Are you laughing at me? And besides, to work for aristocrats and to obey them as though they were gods is contemptible, observed the girl student fiercely. What I propose is not contemptible. It's paradise, an earthly paradise, and there can be no other on earth, Shigalov pronounced authoritatively. For my part, said Liamshin, If I didn't know what to do with 9/10 of mankind, I'd take them and blow them up into the air, instead of putting them in paradise. I'd only leave a handful of educated people who would live happily ever afterwards on scientific principles." "No one but a buffoon can talk like that," cried the girl, flaring up. "He is a buffoon, but he is of use," Madame Virginsky whispered to her. "And possibly that would be the best solution of the problem," said Shigalov, turning hotly to Liamshin. "You certainly don't know what a profound thing you've succeeded in saying, my merry friend. But as it's hardly possible to carry out your idea, we must confine ourselves to an earthly paradise, since that's what they call it." "That's pretty thorough rot," broke, as though involuntarily, from Verkovensky. Without even raising his eyes, however, he went on cutting his nails with perfect nonchalance. "Why is it rot?" Mr. Shigalov is somewhat fanatical in his love for humanity, but remember that Fourier, still more Cabet, and even Proudhon himself advocated a number of the most despotic and even fantastic measures. Mr. Shigalov is perhaps far more sober in his suggestions than they are. I assure you that when one reads his book, it's almost impossible not to agree with some things. He is perhaps less far from realism than anyone, and his earthly paradise is almost the real one, if it ever existed, for the loss of which man is always sighing. "I knew I was in for something," Verkovensky muttered again. "Allow me," said the lame man, getting more and more excited. "Conversations and arguments about the future organization of society are almost an actual necessity for all thinking people nowadays." Herzen was occupied with nothing else all his life. Bielinsky, as I know on very good authority, used to spend whole evenings with his friends, debating and settling beforehand even the minutest, so to speak, domestic, details of the social organization of the future. "Some people go crazy over it," the major observed suddenly. "We are more likely to arrive at something by talking, anyway, than by sitting silent and posing as dictators," Liputin hissed, as though at last venturing to begin the attack. "I didn't mean Shigalov when I said it was rot," Verkovensky mumbled. "You see, gentlemen," he raised his eyebrows a trifle, "to my mind, all these books, Fourier, Cabet, all this talk about the right to work, and Shigalov's theories, are all like novels of which one can write 100,000, an aesthetic entertainment. I can understand that in this little town you are bored, so you rush to ink and paper." "Excuse me," said the lame man, wriggling on his chair. "Though we are provincials and of course objects of commiseration on that ground, yet we know that so far nothing has happened in the world new enough to be worth our weeping at having missed it. It is suggested to us in various pamphlets made abroad and secretly distributed that we should unite and form groups with the sole object of bringing about universal destruction. It's urged that, however much you tinker with the world, you can't make a good job of it, but that by cutting off 100 million heads and so lightening one's burden, one can jump over the ditch more safely. A fine idea, no doubt, but quite as impractical as Shigalov's theories, which you referred to just now so contemptuously." "Well, but I haven't come here for discussion," Verkovensky let drop this significant phrase, and, as though quite unaware of his blunder, drew the candle nearer to him that he might see better. "It's a pity, a great pity, that you haven't come for discussion, and it's a great pity that you are so taken up just now with your toilet." What's my toilet to you? To remove 100 million heads is as difficult as to transform the world by propaganda. Probably more difficult, especially in Russia, Liputin ventured again. It's Russia they rest their hopes on now, said an officer. We've heard they are resting their hopes on it, interposed the lame man. We know that a mysterious finger is pointing to our delightful country as the land most fitted to accomplish the great task. But there's this. By the gradual solution of the problem by propaganda, I shall gain something anyway. I shall have some pleasant talk, at least, and shall even get some recognition from government for my services to the cause of society. But in the second way, by the rapid method of cutting off 100 million heads, what benefit shall I get personally? If you begin advocating that, your tongue might be cut out. Yours certainly would be, observed Verkovensky. You see, and as under the most favorable circumstances, you would not get through such a massacre in less than 50 or at best 30 years. For they are not sheep, you know, and perhaps they would not let themselves be slaughtered. Wouldn't it be better to pack one's bundle and to migrate to some quiet island beyond calm seas, and there close one's eyes tranquilly? Believe me, he tapped on the table significantly with his finger, you will only promote emigration by such propaganda and nothing else. He finished evidently triumphant. He was one of the intellects of the province. 4:15 on Shigolov. Verkovensky speaking. To cut the matter short, for we can't go on talking for another 30 years as people have done for the last 30, I ask you which you prefer, the slow way, which consists in the composition of socialistic romances and the academic ordering of the destinies of humanity 1,000 years hence, while despotism will swallow the savory morsels which would almost fly into your mouths if you'd take a little trouble? Or do you, whatever it may imply, prefer a quicker way which will at last untie your hands and will let humanity make its own social organization in freedom and in action, not on paper? They shout 100 million heads. That may be only a metaphor, but why be afraid of it if, with the slow day dreams on paper, despotism in the course of some 100 years will devour not 100, but 500 million heads? Take note, too, that an incurable invalid will not be cured whatever prescriptions are written for him on paper. On the contrary, if there is a delay, he will grow so corrupt that he will infect us too and contaminate all the fresh forces which one might still reckon upon now, so that we shall all at last come to grief together. I thoroughly agree that it's extremely agreeable to chatter liberally and eloquently, but action is a little trying. However, I am no hand at talking. I came here with communications, and so I beg all the honorable company not to vote, but to simply and directly state which you prefer, walking at a snail's pace in the marsh, or putting on full steam to get across it. I am certainly for crossing at full steam, cried the schoolboy in an ecstasy. So am I, Liamshin chimed in. There can be no doubt about the choice, muttered an officer, followed by another, then by someone else. What struck them all most was that Verkovensky had come with communications, and had himself just promised to speak. Gentlemen, I see that almost all decide for the policy of the manifestos, he said, looking round at the company. All, cried the majority of voices. Shigolov is a man of genius, Do you know he is a genius like Fourier, but bolder like Fourier, stronger? I'll look after him. He's discovered equality. He is in a fever. He is raving. Something quite queer has happened to him, thought Stavrogan. Looking at him once more, both walked on without stopping. He's written a good thing in that manuscript, Verkovensky went on. He suggested a system of spying. Every member of the society spies on the others, and it's his duty to inform against them. Everyone belongs to all and all to everyone. All are slaves and equal in their slavery. In extreme cases, he advocates slander and murder. But the great thing about it is equality. To begin with, the level of education, science, and talents is lowered. A high level of education and science is only possible for great intellects, and they are not wanted. The great intellects have always seized the power and been despots. Great intellects cannot help being despots, and they've always done more harm than good. They will be banished or put to death. Cicero will have his tongue cut out. Copernicus will have his eyes put out. Shakespeare will be stoned. That's Shigalovism. Slaves are bound to be equal. There has been neither freedom or equality without despotism. But in the herd there is bound to be equality, and that's Shigalovism. Ha ha ha! Do you think it strange? I am for Shigalovism. Listen, Stavrogan, to level the mountains is a fine idea, not an absurd one. I'm all for Shigalov. Down with culture. We've had enough science. Even without science, we have material enough to go on for 1,000 years. But one must have discipline. The one thing wanting in the world is discipline. The thirst for culture is an aristocratic thirst. The moment you have family ties or love, you get the desire for property. We will destroy that desire. We make use of drunkenness, slander, spying. We'll make use of incredible corruption. We'll stifle every genius in its infancy. We'll reduce all to a common denominator, complete equality. We've learned a trade, and we are honest men. We need nothing more. That was an answer given by English working men recently. Only the necessary is necessary. That's the motto of the whole world henceforth. But it needs a shock. That's for us, the directors, to look after. Slaves must have directors. Absolute submission. Absolute loss of individuality. But once in 30 years, Shigalov would let them have a shock, and they would all suddenly begin eating one another up, to a certain point, simply as a precaution against boredom. Boredom is an aristocratic sensation. The Shigalovians will have no desires. Desire and suffering are our lot, but Shigalovism is for the slaves. You exclude yourself? Stavrogan broke in again. You too. Do you know, I have thought of giving up the world to the Pope. Let him come forth on foot and barefoot, and show himself to the rabble, saying, See what they have brought me to? And they will all rush after him, even the troops. The Pope at the head, with us around him and below us. Shigalovism. All that's needed is that the Internationale should come to an agreement with the Pope, so it will. And the old chap will agree at once. There's nothing else he can do. Kirillov later on New Religion, taken from the 1980 survival course lecture on Nietzsche. And then he has this man, this character Kirillov, who is the philosopher who came to the conclusion, since there's no God, I must be God. And if I'm God, I have to do something that proves I'm God. And you can't just live an ordinary life. Therefore, you must do something which is spectacular. It must be something which is absolute and proves that you have authority over yourself. Of course, the main proof that you have authority is over your own life. Therefore, to prove that I am God, I must kill myself. That's the logic. To us, it makes no sense. That man is crazy. But it makes perfect sense, and once you reject Christianity, that's very logical. End of the 1980 quote. I am bound to show my unbelief, said Kirillov, walking about the room. I have no higher idea than disbelief in God. I have all the history of mankind on my side. Man has done nothing but invent God so as to go on living and not kill himself. That's the whole of universal history up till now. I am the first one in the whole of human history who would not invent God. Let them know it once for all. Do you understand now that salvation consists in proving this idea to everyone? Who will prove it? I can understand how an atheist could know that there is no God and not kill himself on the spot. To recognize there is no God and not to recognize at that same instant that one is God, oneself, is an absurdity. Else one would certainly kill oneself. If you recognize it, you are sovereign, and then you won't kill yourself, but will live in the greatest glory. But one, the first, must kill himself. For who else will begin and prove it? So I must certainly kill myself, to begin and prove it. Now I am only a God against my will, and I am unhappy, because I am bound to assert my will. All are unhappy because all are afraid to express their will. Man has hitherto been so unhappy and so poor because he has been afraid to assert his will in the highest point, and has shown his self-will only in little things, like a schoolboy. I am awfully unhappy, for I am awfully afraid. Terror is the curse of man. But I will assert my will. I am bound to believe that I don't believe. I will begin and make an end of it, and open the door, and will save. That's the only thing that will save mankind, and will recreate the next generation physically. For with this present physical nature, man can't get on without his former God, I believe. For 3 years I've been seeking for the attribute of my Godhead, and I've found it. The attribute of my Godhead is self-will. That's all I can do to prove in the highest point my independence and my new terrible freedom. For it is terrible. I am killing myself to prove my independence and my new terrible freedom. Taken from the 1980 Survival Course lecture on Nietzsche again. Therefore, finally, since he has human nature, he's scared of killing himself, and he's constantly hesitating. Then along comes a character like Lenin, who's this Verkhovensky, who uses this, tries to persuade him to kill himself, and then blame it on somebody else, in order to gain some kind of a disorder, so that his revolutionary circle could begin to take over. And he finally persuades him. He says, "All right, go on, kill yourself. Sign this paper that says you'll down with the capitalists and so forth, and then you'll kill yourself. I'll stand right here and hold the door open for you." And he says, "No, I can't. I must do it on a big scale. I must do it in front of everybody. He says, "No, no, just do it quiet here, and the note is all written here." And I think he finally pushes him, finally kills himself. These kind of people are with us. They're all over the place. End quote. 2. Crime and punishment. On men who want to be beyond good and evil, kills for an idea, aka Napoleon, Superman, but ends in repentance and opening of Christian life. Taken from Father Seraphim's taped lecture on Russian literature. Although a large part of the book, Crime and Punishment, is before he kills the woman, he is constantly thinking that he should do it. And he goes through these. It's basically Nietzsche's idea that if there is no God, then everything is permitted. And this, of course, has its philosophical, political form. But from the Christian point of view, this means that I can do anything. And he keeps thinking of Napoleon. Here's a man who comes from the ranks, and he goes out, becomes the leader of a country, and he's allowed to kill whoever he wants, just because he's the head of the country. That means there must be a class of supermen. It's based upon entirely, in fact, this is, the kingdoms of this world versus the kingdom of Christ. According to the kingdom of Christ, we must all humble ourselves before God. And according to the philosophy of the world, of the power of this world, there are some people who are strong. If you are strong, you have the right to trample on others. He's Machiavellian. Government can do what it wants as long as the prince has the power. Or Nietzsche, that you can do anything you want as long as you are one of these supermen. And so he's going through these agonizing dialogues with himself. He goes and visits the woman. He sees how she behaves. He's casting the joint, seeing how he will do it. Where she goes, where she keeps the money. And there's this second woman, her sister it is, and the one he begins to build in his mind an image that she's hateful, she's just like an insect. All these actually unchristian things that they come from rationalistic ideas which were coming from the West. And you look at what Marx came up with in the West. Actually, the idea that you can go and do whatever you want as long as you take over, make people violent. It's part of the idea that the revolution goes on when people kill each other. It also makes them violent. And therefore they can be tools for the revolution. In other words, people are being used as things. That's exactly the opposite of Christianity. But his conscience is there, he can't help it, and therefore he keeps hesitating, and he condemns himself. Are you so weak you can't do it? He's accusing himself. You're supposed to be a Superman, and you can't do it? You can't go through with it. And finally he gets the nerve, and goes and hits. I think debates whether he should kill them both or just one. Finally, he gets. The other woman comes in or something at the last minute. He didn't want to kill her and gets all upset by that, and decides he has to kill her too. And then he's stuck. I think he takes hardly any money, just a little. He gets so hysterical he goes and hides it someplace, and then begins his torments. If he's Superman, he should feel absolutely cool and calm. She's just a flea, some kind of insect. She doesn't need to live. And I'm the Superman. I'm going to prepare myself by college education so I can help the Western ideas to come to enlighten Russia. But meanwhile, his conscience begins to operate and he cannot understand why he's not at peace. For one thing, he faults himself because he didn't get the money. But then something happens inside of him, and shows this Christianity cannot be the conscience planted by God and developed by the Christian church, cannot be silenced. And then begins this terrible duel between him and this interrogator, who is investigating the case. And he never knows whether he knows he did it, suspects he did it, whether he suspects somebody else, but is constantly, if he didn't have a bad conscience, he wouldn't have any problem. And in the end, it turns out that this investigator is just waiting for him to confess. And finally he says, "Who do you think it is? Tell me." And he said, "Why, it's you, Rodya Romanovich. You killed her. But I'm waiting for you to come by yourself and tell us." And so he goes almost crazy. What should he do? Should he run away? And then he meets this girl, Sonia, who is a prostitute. That is the lowest element of society and outside Christianity, Christian sympathy or anything. Why is she a prostitute? Because she has to support her mother. And she didn't want to do it. She has Christian faith. But she has to. It's the only way she can get money. In other words, this absolutely helpless, pitiful creature. And she's going to be the one that saves the man who is deluded by these Western ideas. And he begins to talk to her. She shows the gospel. "Oh, gospel? Anything but the gospel," he says. And she begins to talk about Jesus Christ, and gradually his heart begins to soften. And finally he goes to her, I think at the end, to decide whether he should give himself up. And he says, "What shall I do? They'll send me to Siberia, and I'll be finished." And she said, "Oh, I'll come with you to Siberia." And he went. How can this be someone like that, the lowest dregs of society? And she loves me, that she'll come to Siberia to be with me. And he finally is so crushed, he gets on his knees before the police station and says, "I did it, kill me, take me away." And this is a very strong thing, by the way, in the Russian temperament. Well, with Sophia, the case was that she preserved her orthodoxy, her Christianity. Even though externally she was a sinner, she couldn't receive communion, she was constantly in a state of sin. And he, of his own free will, went away from it. And therefore this purity, actually the purity of Christianity, remained in her, even though she was, in fact, the fact that she was a sinner probably even increased it, because she knew that she was no good, the last dregs of society. She was a hopeless case. And yet she retained Jesus Christ, and therefore she could preach the gospel to this sophisticated, although he wasn't too sophisticated, just a student, but he still had these high ideas, and eventually melt his heart and convert him. And then it says that they went to Siberia, and he begins, I think, to describe a little of it. And then he says the rest of the story is a different story, but he doesn't tell you what happened in Siberia, because he went to Siberia and came back a converted man himself. That's probably the most perfect as a work of art of Dostoevsky. It's all complete in one volume. He doesn't just sort of go over his head. End of Russian literature lecture passage. This concludes the second part of Lecture 8, Meaning of Revolution, from the Orthodox Survival Course by Father Seraphim Rose and Father Pod Mashinsky. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and click on the notification bell to be notified of when I post new content. And check out my social media in the description. Thank you, and God bless.